hold on a few minutes
We're
while
live.
Great, thanks. Yeah, we're waiting for folks to file in. Welcome to our last keynote of ISMAR 2021. We'll just give a minute or so for additional folks to join us, and then we'll get started. While we're waiting, I'll just make some quick announcements. There is a Q&A and a chat box where you can post questions for our keynote speaker. You don't have to wait to the end of the talk to post the questions. You can post them anytime you wish, and then we can look at them, obviously, time permitting at the end. Also, as a reminder, Doug Bowman is willing to meet with us afterwards in GatherTown Q&A room A1. So that's Q&A track A, room 1. You can also click on Doug's name and say navigate to or follow, and GatherTown will whisk you. It's not quite teleportation. In fact, it's you are automatically locomoted there. So I'm making up words here. Okay, we got a few more coming in. We're about one after, just a couple more moments, and then we'll get started. Okay, looks like we're getting somewhat steady state here. So let's get started. I am very happy and humbled to introduce a colleague and a collaborator here at Virginia Tech, Dr. Doug Bowman. Doug is Frank J. Meyer Professor of Computer Science at Virginia Tech, and also serves as the director for Virginia Tech's Center for Human-Computer Interaction, one of the oldest HCI groups in the world, and currently home to at least 56 interdisciplinary faculty from 21 units and 5 colleges across Virginia Tech, including engineering, arts, human sciences, architecture, business, and more. And the growth in the HCI Center in the past few years has been phenomenal under Doug's leadership. Doug is the principal investigator of the 3D Interaction Group, focusing on topics of three-dimensional user interface design in both virtual and augmented reality, looking recently on at a number of important issues in AR user experience, including the topic of today's keynote, Everyday AR. Doug is one of the co-authors of a book some of you may have in your collection, 3D User Interfaces, Theory and Practice. And if you don't have this book, I strongly recommend it. Doug's scholarly work has been cited over 14,000 times. And in fact, a paper that we co-authored in 2002 has been cited, according to Google, 528 times, which is Doug's 4th most cited paper, and from what I can tell, Presence's 3rd most cited paper. So thanks, Doug, for that great collaboration nearly 20 years ago. He served in many roles for the IEEE Virtual Reality Conference, including Program Chair, General Chair on the Steering Committee. As many of you know, but some may not, Doug also helped co-found the IEEE Symposium on 3D User Interfaces, which, if I recall correctly, started off like a workshop, but then blossomed into a fully fledged event or symposium, and now is formally part of IEEE VR, and indeed is part of the name. He received a career award from the National Science Foundation for his work on 3D interaction and has been named an ACM Distinguished Scientist. In 2014, he has also received the Technical Achievement Award from the IEEE Visualization and Graphics Technical Committee. Now, Doug earned his undergraduate degree in mathematics and computer science from Emory University, and received his MS and PhD in computer science from Georgia Tech. Sorry, Yellow Jackets, I know you by no other name. And for those interested in the lineage of VR AR researchers, Doug's advisor was Larry Hodges at Georgia Tech, and Doug has since advised many successful AR VR faculty, some of which are still an integral part of our VGTC community, such as Ryan McMahon, Aegis Copper, and Eric Reagan, to name a few. And then lastly, on a personal note, I just like to say how much I really appreciate, Doug, what you've done for our research, broader research community, but also our local Virginia Tech community. And also thank you for the opportunities that you've afforded me over the years, especially when I was chasing tenure. you all will be hard pressed to find faculty as altruistic and giving as Doug, and we are certainly lucky to have him in Blacksburg. And with that, I'll hand it over for Doug for his keynote address.
Well, thank you so much, Joe, for that kind introduction. I really appreciate it. And I want to congratulate Joe and the other organizers of the conference on a successful ISMAR under, unfortunately, still circumstances where we have to do this virtually, but they've pulled it off admirably. So congratulations to them. Let me bring up my slides. So I'm very thankful and honored to be here with you all today. It's great to be asked to give this closing keynote for ISMAR, I think one of the best research communities out there. And I guess I still think of myself as a relative newcomer to augmented reality. I've done most of my work in virtual reality, but AR clearly is going to have huge impact in the years to come, and that's really what I want to talk about today is everyday augmented reality. And so those of you in the audience for ISMAR are going to be saying, everyday augmented reality, I mean, that's my life, right? I go to the lab every day and I do AR. That's not what I mean, of course, by everyday AR, but we'll dive more into that. So to get started on this topic, I just want to ask you all to do a little exercise here. So I want you to imagine in your mind, close your eyes if you like. I can't tell if you're closing your eyes or not, but if that helps, just picture in your mind what you think the stereotypical augmented reality experience looks like. So if you had to explain to someone what it is you do who's outside this field, and you wanted to give them a real world example of an AR experience, what would that be? Well, I imagine many of you are picturing things like this, applications in construction or applications in manufacturing or maintenance or navigation or design. These are all great and impactful applications of AR technology, but they also all kind of fall into a particular category, I think. They fall into the category of special purpose experiences. They're purpose-built for a particular task or application or need that is transient and that doesn't apply to most people, except for perhaps the navigation example, which all of us do at some point, but we don't spend most of our lives doing navigation. So in thinking about what our mental model of augmented reality is, I think there's a couple of things that come to mind, at least for me. One is, I think that we think of AR as VR's younger cousin, or VR in the real world. And maybe this is a little bit of my own bias since I come from the VR community. But if I think of AR as kind of a new version of VR that exists in the real world, that has some implications. It means that AR is inherently 3D, right? It's a world or a scene or at least 3D objects. It's a virtual world or experience, so it's intended to be kind of this illusion of non-mediation, right? Where it's not like interacting with a computer. And it implies that it's for special purpose applications because that's what VR is for, right? We don't spend all day in VR. Some might think that they would like to, but for the most part, you go into VR, you do your application or your experience, and you come out. So I think we think of AR that way. I also think we think of AR as needing to be very tightly integrated with the real world. And so, obviously that means registration, where we register virtual objects and scenes to physical locations and objects. But I think it also implies that we believe that the AR content needs to be tightly related to those physical locations or objects. So honestly, I think that this comes from the name of the area, the name of the field, augmented reality, AR. So obviously that term augmented reality is parallel to the term virtual reality. So that gives rise to this idea that AR is like VR in the real world. It's also augmented reality, which gives rise to this idea that the augmentations have to be tightly related to the real world that they appear in. So let's look at some, standard definitions of AR and see how these ideas match up. So Steve Feiner had a very simple definition of AR in 2002. It refers to computer displays that add virtual information to user sensory perceptions. Very broad, right? Anything that a computer can display and overlay on top of what we're seeing and sensing from the real world could be AR under this definition. And of course, probably the most cited definition from Ron Azuma, that AR combines real and virtual. It's interactive in real time, and it's registered in 3 dimensions. I just want to point out that neither of these definitions require that the virtual and real content has to be integrated at a semantic level. In other words, that the content has to be related semantically to the real world or the real objects that it appears with. Neither, nor do these definitions suggest that AR is only for infrequent or special purpose applications. And so I want to talk about a slightly different conception of AR that I'm calling everyday AR. And what I mean by this is that in everyday AR, there's a world in which virtual displays are available all the time and anywhere, that those displays contain information and applications that users may need anytime, that users interact with those displays for all their general purpose computing needs, and that virtual displays are registered in the 3-dimensional physical world. So this fits those definitions that we were talking about, but it's trying to broaden the application of AR to be more about general purpose computing and less about special purpose applications that are tightly related to the real world environment. So I use that term virtual displays in the definition, and a virtual display can be lots of things. It can be a simulated physical display, like I replace my desktop computer monitor with a virtual monitor, or I replace my physical smartphone with a virtual smartphone. It can just be an application or a window, or it could be a 3D object or scene. So any of those things I think would fit. And obviously, if we're going to achieve this vision for general purpose computing with AR, we have to have all-day AR glasses. I'm not working on those. I know that some of you are working on technologies that will be used in all-day AR glasses. There are certainly a lot of companies that are banking on that as well. But this is going to be needed, that we have glasses that are small, light, comfortable form factor, high resolution, wide field of view, all-day battery life, good computing power, all of those things in order to achieve this vision. And I believe we'll get there. That's not what this talk is about. This talk is about when we get there, what do we do, and how do we design the user experience? So obviously this idea of everyday AR is related to several other metaphors or conceptions that have been out there for many years. So it reminds me, first of all, of this book, The End of Hardware, by Hanich, which talks about AR basically replacing all physical displays. So instead of having a physical laptop display, smartphone display, TV display, that we can use AR to simulate all of those. And so it's in a sense the ultimate display, to borrow a phrase from Sutherland. It's also, of course, related to this idea of pervasive AR that Grubert and colleagues published in 2017. And here's some pictures from that work, where they envisioned, again, that AR would be this continuous experience that you would take with you through all different contexts as you go throughout your day, and could be used for special purpose applications like navigation there in the middle, but also for just everyday needs like checking your calendar or your to-do list in that left-hand image. So I said that we want everyday AR to apply to general purpose, everyday computing scenarios. And of course, for most of us, there are really two categories of such scenarios, at least in today's world. And that is kind of desktop or personal computing and smartphone use. So that leads me to the two metaphors that I'll be talking about today during the talk. So first, everyday AR metaphor is a virtual desktop monitor. So how do we replace or augment our current PC displays to do focused work, productivity tasks, multitasking, and potentially, again, replacing all of those physical displays so that we can do PC computing anywhere. And the second metaphor, of course, is that everyday AR can be a wearable smartphone. So this is an always-on device that has many different apps on it that we primarily use for information access or consumption. It's rapid access and can be done anywhere or anytime. So let me dive into that first metaphor and talk about some of the work that we've done and some of the user experience considerations. So multi-monitor systems have been around for a long time. I dug up this picture from my colleague Chris North's gigapixel display project back about 10 or 15 years ago. And the idea, of course, is that we want more screen space so that we can be more productive. And maybe this is a little bit overboard for most of our personal computing needs, but there are definitely studies that show that we can use this extra space to more easily access information, to more easily multitask when we have many different applications or windows or documents that we are using in order to do some sort of knowledge work. So of course, the problem with these multi-monitor displays is illustrated on the lower right, and that is that they are difficult to set up. They are hard to reconfigure. In the case of this project, each of these kind of columns of 3 monitors required a big beefy PC at the time to drive it. And so this was a really complicated system. And most people don't have the money, the space, the expertise, or the time to set up such a system. So the AR virtual monitor's vision is very simple. Let's use AR glasses to display those monitors as virtual objects, virtual displays. And we can have as many of them as we want. They can be as big or as small as we need them to be. We can rearrange them, and we can use them to work anywhere, for example, on a train or on an airplane. All right, so if we're going to do this, what should the user experience be like? And I think the very first UX objective has to be to first do no harm. In other words, AR virtual monitors need to provide at least the same level of performance, usability, and comfort as physical monitors. We need to get at least to that baseline before we can go farther. And so there's some barriers to this, obviously. If you've used AR systems, you know that we don't have sufficient field of view or resolution. Virtual content is currently still non-opaque. You can still see through it, at least partially. It's got a fixed accommodation distance, and that distance may be farther away than you want your virtual monitors to be. And the headsets still are lacking to some extent in ergonomics, size and weight and comfort. So we still thought, well, let's see how well this can work with current technology. So using the HoloLens 2, we built a prototype of a virtual multi-mon system. And you see the video here. This is real Windows 10 running on a PC connected to the HoloLens. And we can use regular mouse and keyboard interactions to interact with all of these windows and applications that are spread across our virtual screens. You can see that we had to do a couple of things to the virtual monitors compared to what the real monitors would be like. First of all, we moved them farther away to account for that accommodation distance. They're 2 meters away. And that means that they're also larger. In fact, they're even bigger than that. We had to make them 1.5 times angular size what the physical monitor would be in order to make them readable, given the resolution and transparency issues. But still, this is quite a nice experience. And of course, we don't have to do only virtual. We can also do hybrid. We can combine virtual monitors with physical monitors. And so here's a setup that does that: a single high resolution physical monitor in the center and 2 virtual monitors off to the sides. And again, for readability issues, we moved those virtual monitors farther away and made them slightly larger, or 1.5 times larger in angular size. And so there's a bit of a disconnect here between the central monitor and the virtual monitors, but maybe the kind of familiarity and usability of the central physical monitor makes up for that. So we ran a study, and this was published this year at IEEE VR. And in this study, we compared those 2 conditions you just saw, the virtual monitors condition and the hybrid monitors condition, with a physical 3-monitor setup. And we had people do typical kind of multi-window, multi-application tasks. And there were some good findings here, some good results. We found that people, all participants completed all tasks in all conditions, and that there were no significant differences in accuracy. So people were able to do their work and do it well. When we asked people about the experience, for example, with statements like, I think I was able to focus on my work, or I felt that I delivered a quality result on the task, there were similar ratings, non-significant differences between the conditions. And so we conclude that these virtual monitors can be used for real world work now, even using current technology, at least for short periods of time. Obviously, we didn't have people do this for an entire day or for a week. But there's still a performance penalty. So as you see in the graph there, the virtual condition was 14% slower than the physical condition, and that was a significant difference. The hybrid was somewhere in between, and there were no significant differences with hybrid. So my student Leo, who did that first study, did a follow-up study where he replicated the same conditions, but he updated the hardware and software using a custom prototype. Is actually in VR, not AR, to get rid of some of the transparency issues. It used custom software that tried to optimize readability. In addition, he added another condition, which was just a single laptop monitor to do the same tasks. And so one piece of good news is that we did reduce the performance penalty of the virtual monitors. It's now only 11% slower than the physical monitors. But more importantly, the virtual hybrid multi-mon, the virtual and hybrid multi-mon systems both improved productivity compared to the laptop. So the big takeaway from this is that extending physical monitors with AR virtual monitors does have measurable benefits, again, even now with today's technology. So for this first UX objective, I think we're not quite there yet. The current AR hardware still needs improvement. Current AR software still needs improvement as well. But at least we can take away that AR virtual monitors are feasible for real world work, and they can provide benefits over single physical screens. So moving on, second UX objective for AR virtual monitors, obviously, is that we can do much more with AR than just exactly replicate what we see with physical monitors. So let's enhance the user experience using the flexibility and power of AR. And there's lots of opportunities here. So some simple things, we can of course add and remove monitors, add and remove space as needed. We can rearrange or resize monitors on the fly because they're just virtual. We can remove the borders between monitors if we want to. We can make use of the fact that this is a 3D system, and maybe we can position virtual monitors or windows in three-dimensional space and or rotate them in three-dimensional space to improve space usage or usability in different ways. And again, lots of other ideas here that we could brainstorm. So just a couple of simple things that we've looked at. These are the same two pictures I showed you before, but if you look at them in a different way, maybe this user doesn't have any sort of physical display. Well, even without a physical display, right, you can still do computing because you can do virtual displays, so you can create more space that way. Or if you only have a laptop or a single physical monitor, you can extend that. And the study that I shared showed that that was effective. But of course, there's better things that we can do. We can have more flexible space. So I'm sorry that this is just a sketch. We actually have implemented this, but I don't have a good image or video of it to show you. This is a virtual canvas, right? Where we can curve the canvas and we can make it as large as we want. And we can make it a transparent background so that it basically appears that you can just place windows anywhere in the physical space in front of you. Or if you have a physical monitor, you can extend that with this kind of large or even infinite canvas. And it's really a magical experience to drag a window off of your physical monitor just into space and place it wherever you want. So again, we've implemented this. And there's a study that's about to begin that's going to look at those conditions. But again, I think we can do things even more interesting. So we can make dynamic use of space, or use of space that is not like physical monitors at all. And so this is a prototype that Leo put together that we call the containers UI. And in the containers UI, I'm sorry for the slowness of the video here. In the containers UI, we have these slots, 6 slots surrounding the physical monitor, and you can drag windows out towards one of those slots, and it will snap to it and go full screen in that slot. And since there are 6 of them, and we don't want to take up too much angular space, you can see that not a whole lot of the window is visible within each of those slots. Again, we're trying to maintain readability, but you can still interact with it. But when you need to interact with it where you see more of the document or more of the application, you just look at it and press a button, and that virtual monitor, that slot can become full size and the other ones move to get out of the way. So that's an example of the sort of flexibility and dynamism that we can have with AR virtual monitors. All right, so I'm going to move on to the second metaphor, which is the wearable smartphone metaphor for everyday AR. And we've done even more work in this space. So, of course, many of you know that I'm an Apple guy. And so when I think about smartphones, of course, I think about the iPhone. Actually, it's not this iPhone that I think of. First thing that I think of is this iPhone. You may or may not have seen this. The VPL iPhone was one of the first, if not the first, commercially available head-mounted display. And I think they used the term iPhone, EYE, phone, because they were thinking of it in analogy to earphones, right? So earphones allow you to present virtual information in some sense to your auditory sense, and the iPhone was intended to present virtual information to your visual sense. But I would like to use iPhone, EYE phone in a different way. I'd like to think of it as all the stuff that's on your phone, all the apps and experiences that are on your phone, but available directly to your eyes through AR glasses. So how do we achieve that? Well, as soon as you say this, the first objection that's going to come up is that there are lots of potential problems with this. And if you've seen this video, Hyperreality by Matsuda, I encourage you to go take a look at it afterwards if you haven't seen it. It's a really kind of dystopian view of what it might be like if we have everyday AR. And as you can see from these screenshots, we've got advertisements everywhere that are kind of crowding our vision. We've got notifications that are coming in that may or may not be wanted. We've got all sorts of applications that are kind of competing for our visual attention. It's a world that's occluded, that's overloaded, that's distracting, that's cluttered, and that really might make you want to tear your AR glasses off and never put them on again. So how do we avoid this? Well, we are using an approach that we call glanceable AR. And glanceable AR looks at how do we provide on-the-go information access for smartphone-like apps without all of these negative effects. And so the idea is that information resides in the visual periphery and it remains unobtrusive until needed. And then when you need to access the information, you can do so rapidly at a glance, hands-free. And so the illustration here gives you an idea of that. You're walking along, these apps are kind of following you in the periphery. And when you need to know, let's say, the weather, you turn your head and the system realizes that you are looking at that. It will expand it briefly while you get the information, and then you can look away again and go on with what you're doing. So information access is considered to be a secondary and temporary task in this idea. So we wanted to see how we could really achieve this. And so the first objective, of course, for the glanceable AR user experience is that we have to be unobtrusive. In other words, the real world has to be prioritized, and we don't want to negatively impact your experience of the real world. But there's lots of barriers to this. I mean, we're using AR glasses that are on your face all the time. So the display is always visible. The virtual content that is going to get put on the display at some point can interfere with viewing real world information, and it can interfere with your awareness of the real world. Both display fixed content and full size content can cause occlusion problems. So this video here shows a little study that my student Feiyu did recently, where he compared a bunch of different conditions. This is kind of a heads-up display condition with a full-size app. This is a heads-up display with an iconic version of the app. And then we have these so-called head glance conditions where the information, the apps are off in the periphery, either full-size or iconic. And what we found I won't go through all the details of this chart, but what we found is that the HUD conditions were worse in terms of the interface getting in the way or being annoying. And also the full-size app conditions were worse in that way. But the head glance and icon conditions were much better in terms of not noticing the interface and the interface being preferred to access information. So we take this as kind of a mandate to make sure that the unobstructed view of the real world is maintained most of the time, and that the virtual content is minimal until you want it. So there's lots of ways that we can achieve this goal of being unobtrusive. So we've looked at several approaches. The approach you're seeing here is just using world fixed content, but making sure to place it in locations where it doesn't include anything important. So here we have another desktop computing scenario, and we've got these apps that are docked around the monitors. And the only thing that's behind, from the user's perspective, that's behind those apps is just the wall. And so there's nothing you need to see in the real world there. And so these are good locations to place the apps. Still, we make these apps kind of minimal until you look at them, and then they can expand to give you more information so that they're not distracting. So that's one approach. A second approach is to use body fixed content, what I've already shown you with the head glance technique. And so here's another video showing that. You know, you're walking down the hall, the only thing you see is the real world until you turn your head towards this app content, and only then do you view it. It normally resides outside the field of view. So we compared that approach to, again, a HUD, and to another condition that basically used a HUD, but where the content didn't come into view until you gazed at these little gaze targets on the periphery of the display. So those two techniques, and then again, here's this head glance technique where the content really is off screen until you turn your head to look at it. And surprisingly, in this study we did where people were walking around the lab and also answering questions from these apps, we found that the HUD actually performed quite well. And so that walking task wasn't demanding enough. There wasn't enough potential occlusion to make it obvious that we needed this more unobtrusive approach. So I'll tell you about another study in a minute where we got more data about that. The other approach that we can use for being unobtrusive, of course, is that we can place content anywhere, but just make sure that that content is mostly invisible until the user activates it. And so here's a study that we did in VR, but simulating AR, where we have, again, these kind of glanceable apps that are surrounding you, but you also want to monitor what this child is doing. And so the approach that you're seeing here is that the apps are mostly transparent all the time, but if you need to look at them in order to answer a question, in the case of our experiment, you can just click on them in order to make them temporarily opaque. And when we asked people in the study about what their favorite techniques were, more than half picked the techniques where the real world was prioritized. In other words, the content was by default transparent. And then others liked these techniques where the content would automatically become transparent if it detected an occlusion, but those were not preferred as much as the ones where it was just transparent by default. Okay. So objective number one, be obtrusive. The second objective for AR wearable smartphone is to enable rapid access to virtual content. We want to be able to very quickly get the weather information, get the calendar information, get the to-do information, and then go back to what we're doing in the real world. And so there's a lot of barriers to achieving this objective as well. It's really at odds with objective number one. The more unobtrusive you make the virtual content, then kind of inherently, the harder it is to access it. So if you really only wanted to enable rapid access, you would always do a heads-up display because the content is always there on the display for you. You can access it immediately. But of course, that's also the most obtrusive. So how do we do both? How do we kind of beat this trade-off between efficiency of access and unobtrusiveness? If we move content into the periphery and minimize it to a little minimal icon, then that's going to slow down information access. And so this, and the standard activation technique that's been used in many AR interfaces, that is the dwell technique, where you do eye tracking, and after some period of time where the user is looking at the content, it expands. That's slow by default because it's time-based. So we've been exploring novel activation techniques that can be more rapid. And so the one that I think is the most interesting is this technique that we call fixation glance. And so here you can see that the content is just represented as a little tiny icon. It's just a dot in this case off in the periphery. And by using eye tracking with both eyes through the magic leap, we can not only tell, what direction the user is looking, but also we can tell the vergence angle. And so we don't expand the content until you're looking in the direction of the icon and your eyes verge to the depth of the icon. So when you want to look at the real world behind the icon, like here, you want to concentrate on slicing the vegetable. I cringe every time at this point in the video because I think he's going to cut his finger off. Then you can look through the icon to what you're doing in the real world. When you want to get to the virtual content, you just look at the icon with both eyes, verge to that depth, and then the virtual content appears. And this is a really magical feeling technique to me if the eye tracking is calibrated well. My student Fei Yu, who you saw there in the video, has been doing a study recently that'll be published in SUI this year on novel activation techniques for virtual content. So we've got that fixation glance technique I just showed you, but we've got several other techniques. So here's a blink technique where we do just a double blink in order to display the virtual content. There's our fixation glance technique. We have a hand overlap technique where you just put your hand in front of the real world in order to trigger the virtual content. And then a head depth technique where you just lean backwards to activate the virtual content. So here are some, this is just the time results from that study. Since we're focusing on rapid access, there's a lot of other user experience results from that study. But what you can see is that, especially in the desktop task, this what's called the sitting task here, the dwell technique was really slow, right? The head depth technique was quite slow in the walking because when you walk, your head is bobbing back and forth anyway, so it's hard to control the depth of your head. Blink, I think, was the most effective technique overall. It worked well in every setting. It's not the most natural though. Fixation glance was also excellent. But it was better in our walking scenario than it was in our sitting scenario. And the reason for that is that in our sitting scenario, the virtual content was almost at the same depth as the real world sign that we asked people to read. And so the eye tracking wasn't good enough to give us discrimination between which object the user was looking at. In the walking technique, there was a much greater separation in depth. And so fixation glance was a much better approach there. All right, so that's rapid access. A third UX objective for glanceable AR is that we really want it to fit into every authentic scenarios from everyday life. We're doing everyday AR after all. And so I think this is pretty difficult. There are big obstacles to get this glanceable AR approach to really work with my life. I can do it in the lab and with kind of toy tasks and studies, but does it really work with the way that I live my life? And some barriers here, I mean, it's unfamiliar, right? People are not used to wearing AR glasses. Almost nobody owns AR glasses at this point. Social acceptance can be a problem. Everybody knows what, people who wore Google Glass were called, right? And there's high satisfaction with current solutions. I mean, there's a reason why something like 5 billion people around the world own a smartphone. It works really well in many situations. And when you add accessories to it, like a smart watch, so that you don't have to pull out your phone all the time, it can be even better. So making glanceable AR into something that can beat those current approaches is a tall order. So we've done a couple of studies here. So Fei Yu has done a couple of different prototypes. This first one was a video prototype where he showed himself using glanceable AR in various scenarios. So computer use that you saw there, exercising outdoors, and also cooking. And he showed how, these apps could come along with you to whatever context you wanted. He showed how you could interact with them potentially. He showed how they could stay out of the way when you needed to look at the real world. He showed how it would be very convenient to get information through AR, through a glanceable AR system, and so on. And so again, it was just a video prototype. We did this study during the pandemic, so this was a great way to get people's opinions about it without having them come to the lab or wear a headset. And there was some good findings here. So there were both pros and cons that people listed when asked for their reactions to this video. The pros were what we expected, that it was hands-free, that it seemed convenient, that it was non-intrusive. But some people were also worried that it might be distracting or invasive or overwhelming. Still, when we asked them if they would be willing to use such a system in daily life, and I should caveat this, we didn't ask them if they'd be willing to use this hardware. This is the Magic Leap one, obviously. We said, imagine that this sort of interface is presented via a lightweight pair of glasses. And over half of people said that they would be willing to use such a system. And when we pushed them to compare it to existing devices like phones, tablets, and smartwatches, they said that they thought glanceable AR could be easier to check information while moving, that it would be easier to check or interact with information when your hands are occupied. And something that I wanted to highlight here is that they thought it would be less distracting, which is really interesting, right? We're worried about AR being more distracting if there's stuff on the display all the time, but they thought it would be less distracting if it was implemented in this way, because you don't have to look away from what you're doing to look at your phone. So he did a second study where he developed a working system that implemented most of the features that you saw in that video. And he also wrote it such that it could people could log into it basically and access their personalized information, their Google account related information, so that they could see their email and their local weather report, their fitness data, their calendar, their news, and their to-do list through this glanceable AR system. And we did it in the wild study. This was done still during the pandemic. So we basically gave our Magic Leap away to several participants who took it home for a few days and tried to use it, for several sessions, several hours each, basically. And then reported on what they found through diaries and interviews. So we collected over 15 hours of use of this system. And we saw that people used it working in front of a computer, while cooking, while watching TV, while gaming, even while attending class virtually. And we got really positive feedback about overall usability. They liked a bunch of the features and thought that it was good for accessing information. Again, we saw that all participants considered this interface to be less distracting than their existing smartphones, and that was really encouraging. And all participants said that they would be willing to use such an interface every day. So a really great result. And again, a somewhat surprising result given the early stage of this. And a particular thing that I think is interesting here is that people said one reason it was less distracting is that there was less context switching. So you're working on something on your computer, you think, oh, do I have a meeting come up? Instead of reaching into your pocket, pulling out your phone, turning on your phone, navigating to the calendar app, instead, you just remember that your calendar is right up there. You glance at it. Oh, the meeting is still 30 minutes away. I can keep working. Boom, back to working again. So less context switching was a huge win for this system. So we wanted to study that in a little bit more depth. And so here in this third study, we did a comparison it's a study that's still ongoing. Actually, we are doing a direct comparison of glanceable AR widgets with smartphone apps for rapid information access during a primary task. So the primary task here is just reading. It's just a proxy for other tasks. So we have people read from a physical piece of paper, and then every so often the system will interrupt them with a question, and they have to look up the answer to that question either through a glanceable app or through a smartphone. So here's a video of that.
How many VIP emails do you have?
10.
How many zone minutes of exercise have you had today?
11.
So the smartphone is pretty fast.
How many VIP emails do you have?
4.
How many zone minutes of exercise have you had today?
13.
But the glanceable widgets, I think, are faster. And so these are preliminary findings. This is not, this study is not complete and it's certainly not published yet. But so far, at least, 93% of our participants found it easier to resume the primary task after accessing information with glanceable AR. And 90% of them preferred glanceable AR to the smartphone overall. Again, I think this is really surprising given how familiar people are with smartphone information access. After the experience, 69% were somewhat or extremely likely to eventually replace their smartphone with AR, compared to 48% who said that before the study. And they listed a bunch of benefits of glanceable AR: efficiency, accessibility, again, less distraction, better focus on primary task, and all apps available at once. That's a big downside of smartphones, right? Is that you can only see one app at a time and you have to navigate in order to see other apps. There are some benefits of the smartphone, but they're the ones that you would expect: familiarity and comfort. And the fact that it can be ignored. You can just turn it over or turn it off and not use it at all if you decide to. All right, so finally, a fourth UX objective for wearable smartphone-based glanceable AR, and that is that it should adapt automatically to the context of use. So Grubert and colleagues in their pervasive AR paper really pointed this out as a key feature of pervasive AR, is that it has to be intelligent and adapt intelligently to use context. So I think there are some barriers to achieving this as well. Adaptive interfaces can be frustrating. There's been kind of mixed success with adaptation in user interfaces over the years in the HCI community. And that's because if you have incorrect or undesired adaptations, it really can reduce usability and performance. People can get frustrated quite easily with bad AI. Here's a couple of illustrations that kind of show what we mean by context adaptivity. In the first one on the top, this guy is cooking and he's got the recipe and the baseball game displayed. He walks over to the refrigerator to get an ingredient, and the recipe comes with him because the recipe is related to what ingredients you need for the dish. But the baseball game stays where it is because that's not relevant to the task he's doing. In the second example, this user is looking at some AR content on monitors or apps, and a colleague walks up for a conversation, and the system detects that they're having a conversation and either removes or makes transparent all that content that would be blocking the person that you're having a conversation with. And you can't read the little captions there, but they start talking about the weather, and the system realizes that and makes the weather app become opaque again so that the user can refer to it. So we've just barely scratched the surface on this, but we have in fact implemented a version of that last scenario with conversation. And so again, we're doing a study now where we have people in a social situation, a conversation with the experimenter, and we have occasional information access tasks. And we're comparing, again, the smartphone versus just regular glanceable AR, where the apps are not, they don't adapt intelligently, versus context intelligent AR. And so let me show you what that looks like.
What do you usually do in your free time?
In my free time, I usually go hiking, and sometimes I play guitar and I also play video games.
How many zone minutes
Yes,
of
that's all of the
exercise
good
have you had
stuff.
today?
I like all of those.
Thank you.
I personally go hiking a lot.
I have
so
23 zone minutes.
do you like hiking?
Yes, I do.
Nice. Do you like the
Oh, sorry. So that was the manual AR where you have to, the apps all start out transparent. You have to click on the app in order to access the information. So that's kind of the baseline glanceable AR condition. Here's the context intelligent AR.
I personally don't like it because like I love walking, and usually in the cold weather I can't walk a lot. Like right now I think I walked 3,000 steps so far and it's only 9 a.m. How about you actually? Do you like walking? Like how many steps have you walked so far today?
Yeah, I like walking. And today I've walked 2883 steps.
Okay, so what you see there is that the Fitbit app in this case has appeared. It's become opaque because they started talking about exercise and walking, but it also moved up and out of the way, so it's not covering the face of the person that you're having a conversation with. So that's that context intelligent AR. And then the third condition, which you've seen already, is a smartphone condition. So again, this is an ongoing study, but some preliminary findings. This context intelligent AR is the most preferred interface for 62% of our participants so far. And they found it easiest to resume the conversation after using context intelligent AR. Again, it's less of a context switch. It prioritizes the person in the conversation. And in many cases, you don't have to interact at all. Just the right thing happens, which is great. All right, so I'm wrapping up. We've talked about everyday AR as a vision for using AR to present virtual displays that are available all the time and anywhere that allow us to access information and applications and do all of our general purpose computing through these virtual displays. And those displays then can be registered to the three-dimensional physical world, whether registered in a world fixed way or fixed to our body. And so we've talked about some UX principles for two different scenarios, the virtual monitors scenario and the glanceable AR scenario. And I've shown you some approaches for how we can hopefully achieve some of these UX requirements and overcome the barriers. A few more just kind of random notes, I think, about everyday AR. One is that I think based on that, be unobtrusive UX objective, I think especially in the mobile glanceable AR scenario, we really want the real world to be the default view. And it reminded me of the Magic Leap actually provides this physical button on the computing puck called the reality button, which you can press at any time. It doesn't turn off the system, but it removes everything from the display. And I think that's the right idea. But I think we can design our everyday AR interfaces so that reality is the default view. And then we can still rapidly access information and applications when we need them. I think everyday AR needs to be personalized and customizable. It's not going to be one size fits all. I think we've talked about how we can hopefully take advantage of the flexibility and magic of virtual displays. We don't just have to replicate exactly what we do now, but we can really place things anywhere. We can adapt them dynamically. We have kind of full freedom to do what we want with these virtual displays. And then finally, I've been talking about general purpose computing, but I think we do want to allow special purpose AR and VR experiences through everyday AR glasses. And so this would be like the equivalent of like a full screen app on your PC, right? It takes over the whole system. Or Magic Leap has this idea of immersive mode apps, which is kind of the same thing. But I think that should be a special purpose mode. It shouldn't be kind of the default everyday mode. All right, so if you're a student or a designer or a practitioner out there in industry, I think there's a bunch of things that we still need to work on here. So in the AR virtual monitors category, I think we need to understand how the user experience of AR virtual monitors is affected by different scenarios of use. But if I'm using it in the coffee shop or on the airplane, how is that different from using it in my office? How should virtual monitors adapt intelligently? And how can we take advantage of 3D display? We haven't really looked into that yet. In the glanceable AR category, I think scalability is an issue. We've been looking at scenarios where we only have between 4 and 10 applications. But what about when we have dozens of apps like we do on our phone now? What should the interface to that look like? How can the system intelligently predict what apps I'm going to need in different contexts? Maybe that's one way to address scalability. And what's the best approach to displaying notifications? I have a student who's just starting to work on that. A couple of other questions for this research agenda. What other useful forms might everyday AR take? So maybe we want to have a tangible prop of a smartphone, but have it be a virtual smartphone where the screen can be expanded or whatever. I'm sure there's lots of creative ideas there. And then finally, I think this is a super important one. What are the other useful ways that we can adapt the content in everyday AR to the context? And how can we enable those adaptations through AI? All right, well, I need to wrap up, but I can't stop without acknowledging all my great students. And especially in this talk, I've been presenting a lot of work from Leonardo Pavanato, Feiyu Liu, and Shakiba Davari. So thanks to them especially. My collaborators and funding from Microsoft and Google and ONR. My contact information is here. I'm also going to be in GatherTown afterwards, but I think we probably still have a few minutes left now if anyone has any questions. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Doug. We do actually have a few questions. So let's start with Edgar Rojas Nunez from, let's see, he's a lecturer at Costa Rica Institute of Technology, but an incoming assistant professor at Texas A&M. So congratulations on that. Here's your question. A really good presentation. Thank you. I might have missed it, but did you look into using voice as a selection mechanism in the likes of Cortana, Siri, etc.? I imagine a scenario where someone says, show me the calendar, and then the glanceable AI will show that. I also understand that it could be more considered intrusive as compared to a single glance, though.
Right. Yeah, really good question. We have not used voice in that way for exactly the reason that you state. We think that in a lot of these everyday scenarios, people are not going to want to be doing voice interaction. Again, if I'm on the train, if I'm walking around campus, you know, if I'm sitting alone in my house, sure. But voice interaction is probably going to be too intrusive for many scenarios. Still, it's definitely an approach to that rapid access problem and to the scalability problem, because it means you can, as long as you can remember what apps you have, you can pull any of them up with kind of a constant time sort of interaction.
Okay, thank you. We have another question from Dariana Thomas. I don't have an affiliation. This is about the virtual monitors. So have you compared the multiple virtual monitors with multiple real monitors for performance difference?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So that was the first study that I presented here, and it was published last year at VR, or excuse me, this year at IEEE VR. So if you want to look at the paper for all the details there. But yeah, what we found is that currently using the HoloLens 2, the 3 virtual monitors was about 14% slower than 3 physical monitors of the same resolution. And that could be due to many factors that I talked about, like field of view and resolution and transparency and ergonomics and so on. So that performance difference, I think, will continue to go down, but right now that's where it stands.
Thank you. And then we also have a question from Matt. In what ways might we change the physical world's architecture, layout, or furniture in a future with everyday AR?
Wow, that's a really insightful question. I have not thought about that at all, but I bet that there's a lot of industrial designers and architects that would have some great answers to that. I think a lot of our world, especially our work world, is designed around the fact that we need to place physical monitors in different places, that we need to hang TVs on the wall. Even the fact that we have tray tables on airplanes is designed to support doing work on your laptop to some extent, also for eating. But yeah, the design of the world definitely could change if displays could all be virtual. I don't know exactly what that's going to look like, but I think that's a really interesting insight.
Great. Okay. We've got a couple more questions, actually. This is great, and I invite any more as you guys are listening. Okay, this is from John Murray. How do we understand scenarios where one user has access to a head-mounted display like the smart glasses, but the other doesn't? How do we study the potential for participants to feel bad about not having the same access to information in such an interaction?
Yeah, that's another really great question. So this is kind of a cop-out answer, but I do envision that these smart glasses or these AR glasses are going to become so ubiquitous at some point that we don't have to worry about that. So right now, these asymmetric situations with smartphones hardly happen, right? Almost everyone that you come into contact with, you can kind of expect that they have a smartphone. But certainly in this transition period where there's only early adopters and stuff like that, there are definitely going to be these asymmetric situations. And so, I guess that's one of the goals of this adaptive conversation prototype, right? Is to in fact, a study that we would like to run following the current one is to have two participants, one of whom has the AR and the other of whom is just having the conversation, and understand what the acceptance of the non-AR user is for the conversation. I think that it will probably be a better experience for them than if their conversation partner is pulling out their smartphone to check information. If instead they're just glancing away quickly from time to time, I think that'll be a better scenario. Still, we definitely have to worry about how the non-AR users feel about, what are you wearing on your face, and why do you keep looking away, and are you recording me, and things like that.
Okay, we've got a couple more, and why not just take a moment or two. So this is a question: how do you think this technology could affect trust between people in normal conversation? And I think you were kind of getting to that in your last answer. So you can be watching or using a sensible information about the person right in front of them, for example. So I could be looking you up on Facebook or whatever while I'm talking to you.
Right.
You wouldn't even know it. Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure that's a bad thing. No, I mean, I always think back to some early interactions I had with Thad Starner, who you all know is one of the, kind of pioneers of wearable displays. And, he really lived this life, not with AR, but at least with wearable computing, wearable displays on his face. And having a conversation with him was really interesting sometimes. That's a nice way to put it, because you could tell that he wasn't looking at you. He was kind of looking through you in some cases, or away from you. He was working with some input device down at the side. And so you didn't know, was he answering emails? Was he, taking notes about you that he's going to, share with someone else that you don't know about, whatever, right? And so I think our design for this conversation prototype is actually intended to address that to some extent, because what the system does by default is it turns off all the virtual displays when it detects that you're having a conversation with someone, so that you can pay attention to them. And then, only in the case where you either explicitly request it, or when the system detects that you're talking about something that's relevant to some virtual content, does that content pop up. And it pops up in such a way that it's nearby the person you're talking to, but not covering their face. And so we're never going to completely address all of those trust and social awkwardness issues, but I think it'll be better than if we had just kind of fully manual wearable AR.
Thanks, Doug. There are other questions, but I'm going to have to ask that those that pose those questions and others, please follow us when we wrap up here into GatherTown. Again, Q&A track A, room A1, to continue this conversation. Please join me in a sort of virtual round of applause. Thank you, Doug. That's not very loud. Here we go. There we go. And then I guess one other just quick announcement, a reminder that we have some EU funding announcements and a panel on a community discussion on planning a virtual experience research accelerator. Both of these things start up, or this programming starts up at 1600 CEST in just a little bit. So with that, we'll close out this webinar. Thank Doug again, appreciate it. And we'll see you guys over in GatherTown for some follow-up Q&A. Thanks again, Doug.